Yes, my name is Joseph, and I currently live in Seoul. I'm a professor at Seongyungwan University in the business school, and I work mostly in nonverbal communication. And I'm the head of a company called H2H. We do communication with mostly international companies here, basically companies that are in Korea but have a global presence. And I show the employees how to communicate more effectively. I was born in South Korea, and my family emigrated in the mid-70s, 1976. And my parents were both international students. So they went to study. My father studied business, and my mother studied education. But eventually, my mom gave up her studies so that she could, take care of us, take care of the family. So my father was the one who was in school full-time, yeah. My father started full-time in the MBA program, but then they needed money. So he decided to go to night school, and then he switched to the executive MBA. So the classes there were from 7 to 10, Monday through Thursday. And so the only job that he could get was at an army supply shop. He actually wasn't allowed to work on an F1 visa, but there was a Korean owner, and they probably paid him less than minimum wage to work there. So he worked there from 7 a.m. till 5 p.m. and then went to school. So from the ages of 4 to about 11, I didn't see my father. The only time I saw him was on Sundays, because he slept only 3 hours a day for like 7, 8 years, except for the weekends. He says Saturday night, he got to sleep in a little bit, and he went to the church morning prayer meeting, but that was sleeping in for him. So my father's such a hard worker, and that's all he knew, right? So that's the kind of life. So even though he and I slept in the same house, he would get back around midnight. My brother and I were already sleeping, and then he would leave the house. To get to work by 6, he'd have to wake up at 4, take the bus an hour. That was his whole life. And then my mom worked as a secretary, worked as she spoke English, so she was able to do some translation work. So she just worked your typical job. So that's kind of the environment that I grew up in. And my brother and I, like most people of my era, we were latchkey kids, just had to raise ourselves. And we lived in a poor area. And I remember even the place that we lived, a lot of people, there were a lot of immigrants there, a lot of robberies. So my parents were so poor at the time that we qualified for government aid. And so back then, what it was they would give every student like a card. And the card, I remember, was green. So if you had a green card, you could get a free lunch. And I remember I'd get this card, and I was the only one in my class. First, I'm not sure why. I was the only one that had this green card. And I remember the kids would make fun of me, so I feel like they were like doubly making fun of me, like making fun of me being Asian, making fun of me being poor, because to get the lunch you had to show this green card. And then I remember telling my mom, just expecting her to say, just take what you can get, but she didn't. She said, it's okay, I'll just give you money for lunch. And I think about that, and my father must have made like $2.75. Minimum wage was like under $3 back then. The price of a Big Mac was like $1. And when I think about all this, just, how much they tried so hard to, just within the best of their ability to have me fit in. And because they wanted so much for me to fit in. They wanted me to fit in. And this is true of a lot of people in my generation. It's kind of annoying, but I know a lot of people with the same name as me. Imagine just how many people we know that are Korean American that are Grace Park, Jenny Lee, Jennifer Kim, Michael Lee, because our parents wanted us to fit in. And it was hard fitting in. Like in 4th grade, because I grew up in a really poor neighborhood, my parents decided to move us to a good school district. And in elementary school, there were 4 non-white kids. One was my brother. Every teacher was white. Every classmate was white. And in my class, there was one black kid named David, and he and I were and we became best friends only because we were not white. And so just that experience, it obviously colored the way that I looked at the world, that I had to fit in. I had to do what I could to fit in. But like a big moment in my life was when I was 14. So we had to try out for the football team. And then because we were a big school, American football was such a big deal. And we had 2 teams. We had the A team and the B team. If you made the B team, then it meant that you were generally physically smaller, not as skilled, but it was almost 100% having to do with size, speed, and strength. So I remember working so hard, and I remember that I had made the A team and that I was going to be one of the starters, which was like a status symbol for a 14-year-old boy, right? So I was strong, I was big, and then I was so excited. And I remember I just wanted to walk around, and then the A team jerseys were like green and blue, and the B team jerseys were like a different color. I don't remember what, like white or just a different color. So I just wanted to proudly wear this jersey. And I went into the equipment room. And the equipment room had a manager whose name was also Joe. And he was probably in his late 60s, about to retire. I remember he said, "Hey, don't touch that," and he grabbed my arm. And he was a small guy, about this big or so. And he grabbed my arm and he said, "You stupid chink." And so that was the first time that I had, I've been called racist names before, but never by an adult and never by a teacher. So, and then the whole room froze, and every kid in there was white, and they just froze in that kind of young teenage, masculine room. I just held the shirt and I didn't know what to do. I just remember freezing. And I remember I just started crying and crying and crying because I just didn't know how to react to that, right? And then I came home to tell my parents. And like most immigrants of that era, my parents were, deeply Christian. And they said, you need to forgive him and forget about it. So I remember just being so angry. And so the next day, I actually, when I think about this, I just think about how my life trajectory could have changed by this one decision. I actually packed a hammer. And I actually packed a ski mask. And my intent was not to kill Joe, but to break one of his legs. He was already crippled. So I was just going to break the crippled leg. And in my thinking, I would hurt him, but I wouldn't kill him. He's already crippled, so I remember I had it in my backpack. And of course, back then, there was no metal detectors. It wasn't, again, it's a wealthy suburb, right? So I went there, and I just saw him, and I just saw him as just this old guy. I don't know. So then I kind of forgot about it, because my parents said, if you think about something else, you'll forget about it. So I remember I went to school with the hammer, came back with the hammer and ski mask, and surprisingly, I did forget about it. And then I had a mostly normal life. There's always hints of racism here and there, but it was for the most part normal. People who know me now, they'll look at old pictures of me and be like, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe this is you." I used to have really long hair, down to my back, and I played the guitar. And in university, I was involved with this church, so this kind of Asian American church. So the church was one part of my community. I actually wanted to be a musician, so I played in a rock band. I was a guitarist for a rock band. So that, the band was my other community. So every weekend, I went to the University of Illinois, which is about a 3-hour drive south of Chicago. Every weekend, I would go back home to Chicago. And we would practice, play shows. So I did that throughout my university and then for 2 years afterwards as well. Obviously very Asian, mostly Korean in this church with people just like me. And then my band and the rock community was actually even more white than my, than my high school. My brother was the singer of the band, but besides us two, the drummer, the bass player, the clubs that we played in, I'm not talking 90%, I'm talking 100% white. Yeah, this is Latinos and blacks weren't into heavy metal music at the time, and Asians weren't. So I was kind of the different Asian that was into that, yeah. So that's what I wanted to do, and that was kind of my community. Yeah, so I had kind of my life planned out. I was gonna be a rock star, but I never got famous. And so my mom made this deal with me. So I dropped out of school, and she says, if you can't make a living within 2 years, then you're going back to school. So I said, okay. And I was a good student. I majored in philosophy, and I wanted to be a philosophy professor. And yeah, so that's kind of what happened. I didn't make a whole lot of money. I couldn't make a career out of it, so I listened to my mom, and then I went back to school, and then just kind of led a more normal professor's life, I guess, yeah. because I lived in Japan 7 years before here, I kind of had to deal with these issues in Japan. When I went to Japan, nobody thought I was American. They just thought that I was a Korean who spoke English, who could not speak Korean that well. So it's a very different way of looking at your identity. Like Koreans, when they look at me, I'm Korean. I'm a Korean that I'm like, even like my visa, like for many of us is overseas Korean, right? That's my status. I'm an overseas Korean. I'm not a Korean American here. Yeah, I felt so Korean when I lived in Japan. But when I came to Korea, I feel like I feel more American. And it's probably just the environment that I'm in at the school. It kind of told me, I guess there is something different. You know, maybe I'm not cognizant of it, but this sort of bifurcation of my Korean identity and my American identity, like I thought everything, like I would come here and it would just like, I would become fully Korean and I would like listen to K-pop and like do all this stuff. But I came and there is something different. And it's not just linguistic. It's everything from like the words that I choose, the way I choose to live my life, the people that I hang around with. And again, I'm totally comfortable being like being amongst Koreans that don't speak English at all. I'm totally comfortable in that environment, but you know, at the same time, I guess, yeah, I am different. And just by these little things, the fact that my friend could identify me, or the fact that my students look at me differently. You know, like I have students talk to me about like struggles with their family, and I ask them, you know, do you talk about this with your other professors? And they say, usually I can't. And I say, why not? And they say, it's because I have to use Korean. So it's, you know, partly probably because maybe they're close to me, but also because the Korean language makes it so much harder to have these at least more immediate, intimate conversations very quickly, because you have to use the 존댓말, the honorific right away, right? So it's polite, but there's a distance, right? So, you know, so I'm a single father. I have two sons who are teenagers, and like my parents always kind of allowed me to figure out for myself who I was. They allowed me to choose. And I think that compared to some of my other friends, they maybe didn't get that choice. And maybe a lot of young Koreans really feel like, because it's very different, you doing what your parents tell you to do and you making the choice for yourself, even if it's what they wanted you to do all along, right? So, and then with my two sons who come to Korea every summer, I always say, you know, it's your life. I can't live your life. You know, my parents love me, but they can't live my life. I can't live theirs, but they can't. This is still my life. I think that what my parents taught me and what I've realized in my 49 years of life, what I try to teach my children is ultimately it's your life, only you can live it. You know, and you know, you have to be responsible for your mistakes. It's not like I had this perfect life. I think I've had a wonderful life, but you know, there's a lot of mess ups that I've had along the way, and I have to own up to it, and I have to take responsibility for my life and say, this is my life. You know, good or bad, it's my life, and I chose this path. You know, and I know that's not true for everybody. It's not true for people who went through maybe extreme trauma. And so in that sense, you know, I did go through minor trauma growing up like that with the racism and with things like that. But at the same time, I chose this life. I chose to come to Korea. You know, I chose to become a specialist in nonverbal communication. You know, I chose to start a company. I chose to be a professor. And so those choices really, it really gives me a sense of power. Whether I made the wrong or the right choices, that's secondary. But the fact that I could make this choice, you know, so it's really empowering, and in that sense, I feel like my Korean American story is that I felt empowered, you know, to make this choice, and I feel like it's why I've led a very successful life, and I hope to continue to lead a successful life. My name is Joseph Kim, and this is my Korean American story.